All right, let's get started. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to this Torchlight AI webinar. Today, we will be discussing the state of energy security in Europe and the potential for another crisis this winter. My name is Judith Jacob, and I am the Deputy Director of Geopolitical Intelligence here at Torchlight. I'm very pleased to be here chairing the discussion. Here are a few housekeeping points up on the screen. I'm sure none of this is new to anyone here, but the main things to note are that we will be recording this webinar, and everyone who has registered will receive a copy. Secondly, you can submit questions anonymously through the chat function throughout the presentation, and we will address them at the end. We've already received some very good questions that our speakers are looking forward to answering. I would encourage you to submit more as we go along. If there are any questions you would like to ask privately, will come to you after the conclusion of the event, you are also welcome to email us. Our contact details will be provided at the end of the presentation. I am very pleased to introduce our speakers today. Firstly, we have Sebastián Contreras, our head of Europe. Prior to leading our European coverage, Sebastián was an embedded analyst with several clients, with a focus on geopolitical and technological trends in Europe. As our head of Europe, he now provides in-depth geopolitical analysis on the key developments on the continent, including EU-related matters. He holds an MSc in EU politics from the London School of Economics. Secondly, we have Tim Bristow. Tim joined us at the start of the year after a 20-year career in government intelligence. He deployed twice to Afghanistan in support of the NATO military operations there. At Torchlight, he heads the former Soviet Union desk, producing high-quality reports for our clients. Tim holds a master's in international policy from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. Finally, we have Adam Stanley Smith. Adam served in the US Marine Corps as an enlisted reservist and later as an officer. He participated in Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003 and later deployed twice to Japan to conduct training operations across Asia before serving in the Marine Corps Special Operations Command. In 2011, Adam joined another consultancy as their regional director for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. In this role, Adam led hostage negotiations, responded to extortion attempts, and conducted security audits for his consultancy. He is a founding member of the Torchlight team, and Adam is tasked with leading the business development of our Insights product and our physical security assets business unit. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm just going to start by handing over to Tim to kick us off with our discussion.
Thank you, Judith, and good afternoon to everybody. In this webinar, we'll be talking about European energy security in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine and its effect on European energy markets. We'll touch on the major events that brought us to the current situation, and ultimately we ask whether Europe's decoupling from Russian oil and gas markets will mean that Europe will face another winter energy crisis in 2023. We also explore some of the ways that Russia has and will respond to European policy changes. So without further ado, I will turn you over to Sebastián Contreras, Torchlight's head of Europe, to take us into this. So Seb, what were the key events that triggered the energy crisis in 2022? And can you give us a sense of what the economic ramifications were of all of these events?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Hello, everyone. So I will be explaining mainly three events that I think the audience should take into consideration throughout this whole webinar, given that there was a lot that went on in 2022. First of all, just there's a background, I think it is important to remember that Europe was already experiencing a surge in energy prices at the end of 2021 as European economies slowly lifted the restrictions they had introduced to fight COVID-19. And the lifting of restrictions caused a significant rise in demand for consumer goods, which directly also caused an increase in demand for energy to produce them. But I think obviously we need to talk about the elephant in the room, and that was the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and the subsequent weaponization of gas supplies by the Kremlin to induced European governments and the West in general to stop supporting Kiev in its war efforts. Third, probably to event to take into consideration was really the sabotage attack on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, which I would argue introduced a new angle into the whole debate about Europe's energy security, which up until that point, it had really been about the risk of supply. But now we added a new factor, and it was whether the critical energy infrastructure in the continent was at risk. And if markets had not already been a bit in a frantic as supply constraints and the rise in demand had caused prices to increase, the sabotage attack further added to the volatility. And we saw a significant increase in energy prices as a result. And as the next graph shows, we can see how this really affected EU energy prices overall and throughout the continent as a whole. And it really was felt in quite a lot of key consumer sectors, particularly food, which, as you can see from the graph, in countries, for instance, like the UK, caused the population to experience around a threefold increase in food prices, something that had not happened for decades. And in many ways, unsurprisingly, perhaps, this started a shift when we observed it in terms of the rise in anti-government sentiment throughout the region.
Interesting. So some rather extraordinary events happening during this time that have really impacted the whole of Europe. I imagine that Western governments were forced to respond in a number of ways.
Indeed. So, as I mentioned, the significant rise in the cost of living, of course, this rise in anti-government sentiment, and most European governments were particularly worried that it would also lead to substantial episodes of unrest throughout the continent. So what we observed was the rise of an implementation of substantial relief measures to help consumers deal with the crisis. And this ranged from the capping of energy prices to fiscal incentives for particularly low-income households to reduce the consumption of gas. The latter was particularly useful as part of the campaigns that most national governments undertook to induce behavioral changes not only for households but also for the industry to save gas as governments prepared their storage capacity in preparation for the winter ahead. And in many ways this worked. It led to a significant reduction in consumption by both industry and households. And depending on the country, it ranged somewhere between 15 and 20% reduction, which was quite significant. Meanwhile, you had, particularly at the EU level, a very coordinated effort to increase the supply of energy by diversifying its origins, given that Russian gas was no longer an option. And we saw, particularly from the part of the European Commission, a number of very significant deals being made with partners such as Azerbaijan or Egypt, and particularly the United States. And finally, obviously, we had, luckily enough, quite a mild winter in Europe that led to an average of 1 degree, more or less, in the continent, warmer. And in parts of Central and Eastern Europe, it was between 2 and 4 degrees. So this obviously caused a reduction in demand for gas that in many ways allowed quite a lot of those European nations to not have to rely on tapping their gas reserves and allow for the storage capacity to remain relatively high to what the average was at the time in previous years.
Interesting.
So great. If you'll forgive me for interrupting, I just want to take a second to highlight the importance for security personnel to understand the context, not only at a local level, but at the regional and global level, as you're doing here. Simply because our economy is so interconnected today, something that happens far away can have ramifications on our local operations. And if you don't mind me asking, would you say that what we saw over the last year was actually a best case scenario for Europe?
I mean, it is hard to say that it was the best case scenario, given that obviously Russian gas was cut off almost completely, and the rise in energy prices was something that the continent had not really experienced for, I think, ever in many ways. So it's hard to say that it was the best case scenario, but it definitely was not as bad as a lot of people expected. And just as a reminder for the audience, countries like Germany were still, up until recently in the winter, in the level 2 of the gas emergency alert. So, governments had been quite nervous about what would happen. And I think in many ways it was a combination of all these factors, but I think particularly the fact that coordinated response to fill up those gas storage and the reduction in demand really helped, in a sense, pardon the pun, weather the storm in many ways.
So a lot of movement in the markets, some real impacts on European economies and a few very dramatic events. Certainly we seem to be seeing some shifts in our economic status quo. So with that as context, can you maybe give us an indication of where we currently stand? For instance, how does the current state of gas reserves compare to previous years?
Absolutely. I mean, I think all the previously mentioned factors in many ways have kept energy demand down. Obviously, the state of the economy has helped in many ways reduce demand for consumer goods. That also leads to a reduction in demand for industrial outputs. At the same time, I think markets are pretty safe. I think it's pretty safe to say that the supply issue for gas into Europe has relatively been stable for the past few months, and this has largely been thanks to the constant supply of liquefied natural gas from particularly the US. And I think basically the availability of large storage capacity at this point, the supply side and the reduction in demand has sort of tranquilized markets quite a lot. And in many ways, it has led to a decline in prices. Secondly, obviously, the implementation of some of the relief measures that we saw in 2022 have remained in place, and I think they will remain in place throughout the year, as I think European governments don't want to add an extra level of volatility, not only to the market, but I think to consumers in general. So I think some of the measures, particularly the capping of energy prices, will remain in place. One thing that I think has really changed in comparison to what we were at this stage last year is the almost total reduction of Russian influence in the European energy market. According, I think I saw recently, according to a few documents by the European Commission, some of the gas saving measures that will remain in place, as I just said, will basically equivalent to about 60 billion cubic meters of gas saved this year. And this will be more than what Russia currently is expected to be supplying to particularly the EU this year. And we really get into a place where European policymakers, or certainly, it is being rumored that we may be moving to a stage where essentially Russian gas no longer matters. Now, I don't think we will get into a stage where they will be banning any Russian imports, because, for instance, Russian LNG still remains considerable, and policymakers will not want to add any type of volatility to the market by limiting further supply. But I think it's quite telling that no longer the Kremlin has that power, that influence that we saw last year to just turn off the tap and suddenly cause prices to increase. And finally, I think where we find ourselves now as well is observing a significant uptake in the renewable energy capacity, particularly at the EU, which I think added somewhere about 50 gigawatts, of renewable energy capacity last year, which is basically equivalent to 20% of what Russia was exporting in terms of gas last year. And this diversification was not only in terms of building infrastructure for renewable energy, but I think particularly building infrastructure necessary for the regasification of a lot of that added liquefied natural gas. And as you can see in the next graph, Europe, particularly by the end of 2020, but really following the Russian invasion, has really been able to increase the capacity that it has to intake a lot more of that liquefied natural gas. And this, in many ways, has led us to the current situation, which basically we find ourselves, as you can see from the next graph, is basically the gas storage capacity in Europe is substantially higher than what it was in previous years, but 2020. But I like to remind the audience as well, obviously, at that point, most European economies were completely shut down, and the demand for energy was considerably lower than it is today. So in many respects, the situation at the moment is a lot better. And I think it helps us understand a bit more the current situation by looking at how some of the key players have adapted. And I think it's one of the key examples we can look at is the case of Germany, in particular German industry, which, as you can see from the graph, it has really been able to adapt, maintaining some of that industrial output. Obviously, has reduced through a combination of higher gas prices, but quite a lot of this reduction has been the result of manufacturers improving the efficiency of their operations to try and maintain some of that output, but consuming a lot less energy, which I think is quite a significant step.
Seb, apologies for another interruption. Do you see this trend continuing both within Germany and across the EU?
I mean, I think if you take into consideration that, as I mentioned, I don't think we can expect any Russian gas to return to the levels that we have been seeing before the invasion. That means no longer cheap natural gas, particularly for Germany. So I think manufacturers will be obliged to continue making their operations a lot more efficient. And this obviously not only applies to Germany, but I think all the major industrial powers in Europe, particularly those that rely on gas. I think another example is Italy as well. But I think it can also lead to industry deciding that gas is no longer a viable option in the future, and this, I think, will open also the the door for the slow switching to more sustainable types of fuels that will be less expensive the years come, and I'm talking particularly about the case of hydrogen. And I think overall, what all of these developments have led us to is to, at this point, is really what this graph shows, is that gas prices at the moment, we have basically gone back to the point prior to the invasion, which I think is quite a significant development of how all of the factors that I mentioned have really contributed to where we are now. Now, I think it's also important to take into consideration that gas prices remain high compared to what they were, for instance, in 2019, around twice as high. But looking at the graph and seeing the spike that Europe suffered during the summer, the situation is a lot less dire than it was now. Now, obviously, one of the things that I mentioned as well is that the sabotage attacks on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, in my view, added a complete different angle to the whole energy security debate in Europe, particularly in terms of how physical attacks could affect critical infrastructure. And I think, Tim, you have been particularly more involved in the research of this kind of events, and I think that perhaps you could give the audience a bit more of your insights into this. And for instance, do you think that it is likely that say Russia or pro-Russia actors could carry out attacks against energy infrastructure in Europe over the coming months, over the coming years?
Yeah, absolutely. So while Europe's pivot away from Russian gas dependence probably means Moscow's unable to trigger those huge price hikes that we saw last year, there's still other risks like potential damage to infrastructure and other areas. So the thing is, with physical infrastructure of any kind, physical destruction of any infrastructure would necessitate the ingredient of deniability. And this is mostly because sabotage or interference in infrastructure would run a very real risk of triggering NATO's Article 5 if Russia's fingerprints are discovered. That would basically entail a war against Russia, an official war against Russia. Most non-governmental armed groups that are pro-Russian are probably, with talking here about private military companies that have got these kinds of capabilities, they're mostly engaged in Ukraine right now and in Africa and the Middle East. I think it's highly unlikely that any private military companies will begin operating in Europe, at least within the foreseeable future. Individuals that have pro-Russia leanings are always a potential threat, but are unlikely to have the access or resources to engage in anything other than low-level destruction of assets. Most pro-Russia state actors have limited themselves to supplying weaponry, equipment, and cash, also mostly due to the fear of military escalation. Similarly, interference in shipping supplies is always a possibility. Russia right now is engaged in hindering the departure of grain ships coming out of the Black Sea for the Ukrainian grain deal. State-sponsored interference with transportation, such as oil tankers and other shipping, it has its own risks involved in it. It's unlikely, but not impossible, that some pro-Russia countries will actively engage in attacks or sabotage against Western energy infrastructure. Again, this still implies a certain amount of deniability, I would probably presume. A possible exception to that might be Belarus, which could conceivably open a second front against Ukraine, and it could officially enter the conflict. But this is considered by most analysts to be unlikely, at least at the present time. We've already seen Russian spy ships in the North Sea. There have been multiple warnings about sabotage to undersea cables and offshore solar and wind infrastructure. But many of these facilities are either fairly isolated, difficult to access, or well protected, and would require significant resources and knowledge to attack. NATO has also announced it's planning more security for remote and isolated energy infrastructure and undersea communications. All same, Russian-backed sabotage of certain key infrastructure, combined with this plausible deniability element, does remain a possibility in the next year. However, destroying one point of supply would not stop energy supplies flowing from other sources, and would likely only have a minimal impact on long-term, possibly even short-term supplies. After the Nord Stream attacks and after Nord Stream ceased its operations, Europe's almost complete redistribution of its gas and oil supplies, sabotage of energy infrastructure, really is no longer a particularly effective option. Cyber attacks, on the other hand, are a tried and tested go-to for the Kremlin, and include the kind of DOS, denial of service attacks, cyber attacks against major infrastructure like dams, power stations, which I think is called the Internet of Things. This has the potential to cause significant damage. Russian isolation from European markets may actually act as an incentive to continue cyber attacks against European businesses, since it's easy and deniable disruptor that can affect Western profits, business operations, and government processes. Early yesterday, in fact, the website of 3 Dutch and Belgian ports was rendered inaccessible by a DDoS attack by a Russian pro-Russian hacker group. The field of cyber has developed so much in the last few years, and Russia is well known to be a global leader, or indeed antagonist. And one of its targets is assessed to be crucial European energy infrastructure. Maybe this would be a good opportunity to ask Adam his thoughts on these risks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. I would say that the probability of a physical attack is pretty low, just as you mentioned, whereas spillover from a cyber attack is probably much higher. With that said, I think this is a perfect opportunity for clients to review their security measures, both physical and cyber. On the physical side, we should be looking again, access controls, barriers, background checks, and especially our alerting procedures so that we're passing communications effectively in case of an incident. For cyber, as always, I think the biggest thing is to have solid backups of all of our data and to ensure that our systems are properly compartmented so that if there is a compromise, it's limited and they can't destroy all of our systems. I think perhaps most importantly is we need to consider that the line between physical and cyber, especially when it comes for heavy infrastructure, is pretty blurred. Cyber and physical teams need to be working together to protect our assets, whether they be oil tanks or pumps. Anything that is connected to the internet is now a risk vector, and our teams need to be treating it as a possible point of intrusion. I think it's also worth considering that there is a possible threat to our senior leaders. If it's someone with a high public profile, someone known outside of the organization, they could be a target for blackmail or some kind of Russian compromise in order to extract key information or potentially to put pressure on political leaders. And Tim, if you won't mind, I'd like to actually throw a question back to you. Do you think Russia's going to continue to interfere with European elections or continue to put out disinformation campaigns as they've done over the last couple of years?
Absolutely. Russia will continue with its pan-European disinformation campaigns. Just today, 370 or so pro-Russian disinformation sites were discovered in Bulgaria. The tactic, once again, has an element of deniability to it. The main concern is the use of these sites to spread fake news and stories that many people are unable to distinguish from factual stories. While disinformation is mostly used to undermine support for Ukraine, the motive has the same result of undermining trust in media and news sources and contributes to other methods of undermining governments in Europe, like sponsoring protest movements. While it's impossible to say how much of a hand Russia has in organizing discontent in Europe, these are all part of Russia's concept that we all know as hybrid war. Russia sponsors mass demonstrations For example, the September 22 protests in Prague, and there's constant reports of election interference like in the Czech Republic, attempts to destabilize governments such as in Moldova. Russia probably still hopes that some of these extremist parties will win in upcoming elections to gain some kind of an influence foothold in the decision-making process. But Russian hybrid warfare is not going to end just because Russia is no longer a big player in the European oil and gas market. The country has other reasons for continuing, like undermining support for Ukraine being probably the predominant one right now. Breaking even one major European government or causing it to fail could force cracks in the unity of European Union's response to Russian aggression.
Yeah, I think that's quite a good point, given that, just as a reminder, when it comes to the sanctions package, unanimity is required, so any potential influence on a member state that isn't particularly in line with what the sentiment among other member states could really break that unity. I was wondering as well, obviously you were talking about the possibility that cyber attacks, would probably be the main ones to watch out for in terms of critical energy infrastructure in Europe. But I wonder if we could go back as well and maybe just have a look at more, outside the box. Obviously, Russia in many ways has lost Europe as a key energy market, certainly compared to what it was before. I'm just wondering, what sort of tactics will it use now to respond to this new reality? And in many ways, do you think that it could find other ways to sort of leverage particularly European energy policy over the coming years?
Well, yeah. As a reaction to being shut out of the European market, Russia was basically forced to expand its export abilities towards more pliant neighbors, like its neighbors in Central Asia, and of course the ever-present lucrative energy market in China. As elsewhere, Russia will not cease exploiting anti-Western sentiment in the former Soviet states, for example, and try to influence internal processes there, like, for example, Georgian Dream's hesitancy to join the EU, the increasing use of the foreign agents bill, type Russian-style foreign agents bills in the former Soviet states to quell dissenting voices. Many former Soviet states, even some energy producers, have actually had problems keeping up with domestic supply, especially during the last, what was for them, a very bitter winter. And this is where Russia is trying, and to some extent succeeding, to fill in the gap. Russia will continue to lobby and negotiate, harangue, and otherwise strong-arm its former Soviet neighbors to buy cheaper Russian gas and oil. Just this week, Russia inked a deal with Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to redirect its Central Asia Center pipeline, the CAC pipeline, to flow back into Uzbekistan. Russia still, however, has only one pipeline into China. I believe it's called the Power of Siberia. And it'll take more than a decade for Russia to build enough pipelines to complete its redirection towards China. And while China and India have been purchasing Russian oil, Russia will continue to face stiff competition in these markets from the Middle East, for example.
It's just a thought, but as far as I know, obviously one of the big consequences of what we observed in the so-called energy crisis in 2022 in Europe was sort of a revival for nuclear. And as far as I know, obviously Russia has relied on nuclear energy for a while. I'm wondering whether you think there's also could be a way for them to potentially explore some kind of or influence European energy policy in that area.
Absolutely. I think that this is a very strong possibility. In fact, European nuclear power sector is highly dependent on imports of Russian uranium. In 2020, EU countries received roughly 20% of their uranium needs from Russia. But blocking and replacing Russia's deliveries of uranium, its reactors and nuclear technology to the rest of the world is a lot easier said than done. In 2022, Kazakhstan, a Russian satellite, if you wish, definitely with a kind of a client state, has produced the largest share of raw uranium from mines, around 43% of world supply, followed by Canada, Namibia, and Uzbekistan. Another of the satellites is the 5th largest producer. Russia is the 6th, by the way, with an estimated 486,000 tons of uranium, equivalent of about 8% of global supply. But raw uranium is only part of the question. It's not suitable as fuel for nuclear plants. It needs to be refined into uranium concentrate, converted into gas, and then enriched. These are processes that Russia excels in. It is the global leader in this enrichment process, mainly through its government entity called Rosatom. So while Kazakhstan is by leaps and bounds the major producer of raw uranium, more than a third of the global demand for uranium comes in the form of its enriched form of uranium, which is supplied by Russia. Currently, in Europe, there are 11 countries where various types of Soviet-era reactor are all operating, and they are all dependent on nuclear fuel supplies from Russia, including Serbia, Turkey, and a planned new reactor in Hungary. These nuclear power plants are all from the Soviet era, and thus almost completely dependent on parts and fuel supplied by, again, Rosatom, by Russia. Additionally, Russia not only builds these plants and supplies fuel, it also trains people to run them and offers advice on operations and safety and waste disposal, nuclear waste disposal. Finally, Russia has in the past offered very attractive loans to these countries to cover at least 80% of the construction of a nuclear reactor. And these are big facilities, they're expensive facilities. Only a state can afford this kind of facility. It's evident from this that certain countries rely heavily on Russian supplies of raw materials and expertise, which Russia can easily deny, possibly risking temporary but still dangerous shutdowns of European nuclear facilities. President Zelensky, Ukrainian president, called on the international community to ban Russian imports of nuclear power after it seized control of Zaporizhzhia. But unlike embargoes on Russian fossil fuels and the companies like Gazprom, cutting off dependency on Rosatom has been little discussed. And since the invasion of Ukraine, there are currently still no sanctions on Russian nuclear fuel imports for civilian use. Some Western companies are looking for ways to offer alternative fuel in Europe, but it's going to take some time to get the licenses and the approvals. And there are fears that this kind of fuel that they're going to get is going to be more expensive than the alternative coming from Russia. An alliance between the UK, US, Canada, Japan, and France under the auspices of the G7 was recently worked out, aimed at displacing Putin from the international nuclear energy market. However, this alliance is still on paper, and technical issues have yet to be worked out. It also is very likely to find some backlash from these countries that rely heavily on Russian nuclear expertise for uranium extraction, conversion, enrichment, and fabrication, not to mention the reactors that Russia has already agreed to build. Assuming that this alliance actually holds, and that it is able to sideline Moscow in the nuclear field, it is still unlikely to accomplish this in the next few years. Russia is also likely to be in a very good position to undercut any deals made by the alliance. So anyway, said to bring this back, based on these developments, how do we foresee the energy situation for 2023, 2024?
Yeah, thanks. I think really interesting what you discussed. It definitely shows that there is still a way for Russia to influence some of Europe's energy policy. But I think probably the audience realizes by now that all of the factors that I explained before, particularly where we stand at the moment with the gas storage capacity. I anticipate that Europe will not be suffering an energy crisis this coming winter. So I think businesses in particular should see that there will be a decrease in the risk of power outages taking place, or of government introducing some emergency measures that decrease the supply for certain business sectors to supply some consumers, particularly households. I think it is also the economic factors that we are currently experiencing with high interest rates and basically the global economy not running as smoothly as was, for instance, after the COVID crisis. The demand for gas will remain relatively low, and this will prevent industrial demand for gas to rise significantly, which should maintain some of those gas storage capacity relatively safe.
So in some ways, some good news.
Indeed.
Based on, so to conclude, what factors should we be on the lookout for that could potentially change this situation in the coming year?
I mean, obviously, we will. I think it is pretty safe, the situation that we're in, but I would say that there are four main factors that I think businesses and the public in general should be considering. And first is what will happen in the coming summer. Here at Torchlight, we have produced several reports underlining how the drought conditions will be affecting some sectors, particularly hydropower production. And this was a situation that Europe experienced last year. And in fact, the low capacity of reservoir push governments to rely on gas to produce electricity at the height of the summer, as demand for AC and other cooling systems rose significantly. So if we were to have a similar situation or even worse this year, if we could find ourselves in a situation where governments have to or are pushed to rely on those gas storage to produce electricity. Coupled with that, we also need to consider what will happen in the winter, and that is very difficult to say, particularly now that the El Niño weather pattern has begun, and this adds a lot of volatility in terms of what the weather will be like in the winter months, with some analysts suggesting that it could be a lot warmer, but at the same time that it could cause a completely different reaction and make winter a lot colder, which, as we know, probably would be increasing demand for gas substantially. And if storage capacity was already relatively low, given if the summer were very hot, then that could also put some of those storage capacity at a level that governments will be forced to introduce some measures to avoid basically rationing in many ways. The third factor is obviously what will happen with the demand for LNG in Asia, especially now that the Chinese economy has reopened. We don't know to what extent China will be able to recover economically over the coming months, but it is almost certain that if demand for LNG were to rise significantly in Asia, that will push prices higher, as traders will be deciding where to direct their supply, which could make sort of a race starting between Europe and Asia, and subsequently traders will push up prices substantially. The last factor to take into consideration, and it goes back to what Tim was talking about, is this whole new angle about what will happen to the critical energy infrastructure. While I honestly do not think, and my colleagues have explained this, that possibility of a physical attack on energy infrastructure in Europe is low, given the consequences that this would have. Cyber attacks and everything, will still remain a risk. And I think there's any possibility or any successful attack that significantly disrupts some of the flow of electricity, say from a renewable, from a wind farm or solar panels, I think could add some kind of volatility to the market, making prices increase in a sense. But that being said, I think these 4 factors do not massively change the outlook that that we have discussed here. And obviously for businesses, I think given the sort of more positive situation that we are explaining, I think it's also true to say that some of the economic and socio-political implications of this will be that there will be less pressure on governments from the population, and therefore a reduced risk of unrest in comparison to 2022. So I think it is possible that we will see less protests in relation to cost of living, and also less strikes, which will reduce the risk to operations throughout the continent in general.
Thanks a lot, Seb. A lot of food for thought there. So let's ask Adam here if you have any final thoughts from the physical security world, any mistakes that you see clients regularly reporting.
Sure. Yeah, definitely, Tim. I think there's a couple of things that I see regularly. The first is siloed operations, where security teams, intelligence teams fail to talk with the rest of their company. Especially when we're talking infrastructure here, you need to be in constant contact with your maintenance guys, your operations guys, so that you understand when pieces of infrastructure are going to be taken offline, so that way you can properly prepare for it and screen for new workers coming in. Make sure you're doing diligent background checks on them, but also so that you understand the impact on the remaining infrastructure that you have. So what I mean by that is, if a pump goes offline for maintenance, then the other pumps that remain have more importance because there's less of them, and we need to redouble our efforts to protect them. And we're not going to know about that if we're not properly talking with the rest of the company ahead of time. The second issue I see kind of builds on the first one, and it's failure to communicate externally. Security teams will talk amongst themselves, they'll patrol their facilities, whatever, but they won't build the networks that they need to understand what's happening outside of the wire. We need to be talking to local fire departments, local police departments, any kind of security or governmental agency that we can find, and ideally building these networks as far out as we can go, so that not only do we know who to go to when there's an issue or potential issue, but also so that we have a constant flow of information coming in so that we can make the best possible decisions and try to get ahead of potential problems. The next problem I see, number 3 here, is an excessive focus on one issue. Clients, well, all of us security professionals, we tend to focus on one potential problem, whether that be kidnapping, sabotage, cyber attacks, and we tend to highlight that over the risk of all these other different problems that we could potentially see. We need to remember that security is a spectrum. There's a wide variety of different risks that we could see coming up at any one time. These risks have different levels of impact, different probabilities of occurring, but we need to consider them all regardless and build our plan to incorporate countermeasures for every single risk that we can consider. And finally, going back to what we talked about earlier, too many teams are separating their physical security folks from their cyber staff. These days, with the Internet of Things, devices are so intertwined, our risks are so intertwined, that physical security teams and cyber security teams really need to be joined at the hip so that we're dealing with problems together. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Adam. That was very enlightening. So thank you everyone for what I feel was an enlightening and very vociferous discussion. I would like to hand now back over to Judith for Q&A.
Thank you all so much for such a thorough discussion of these issues. We've got a couple of questions from our audience already, and I would encourage people to ask further questions if they have any. So the first question we have is, warmer winters have so far helped Europe manage the transition away from its dependence on Russian energy. However, this climate change must also have costs for other industries. Could you outline the potential downsides for other sectors?
If I can answer that, I think probably the two main ones that I can think of are transport, given that we are likely to see a lot more extreme weather patterns developing that will probably affect the logistics of a lot of operations. I think one key example that I can think of was the significant flood that took place in the Emilia-Romagna region in Italy a few weeks ago. Obviously during the summer, this will be accompanied probably by a substantial increase in number of wildfires that could make certain roads and areas inaccessible and add potentially some costs, extra costs for logistics and transport companies. And I think the second one, and I think this is an issue that it has been in the debate for a while now, and really there hasn't been a single solution, is the insurance sector. As companies more and more are looking at the risk of climate change related damages. And obviously for insurance, it's very difficult to predict this, and particularly the size of some of these damages. So those are the probably two main sectors that I can think of that this will impact the most for now.
Great, thank you so much for answering that, Seb. So I think this one is aimed at Tim, but are there other levers related to energy that Russia can still pull to exert pressure on Europe and its allies? And if so, what are they and how effective will they be?
Well, I think that the major one is going to be nuclear. I'm almost certain of this. But other levers, potentially the LNG market, which I think Seb would probably be more qualified to answer on the effects on Europe. But shutting off the pipeline, the Druzhba pipeline, and there's also the possibility of complete shutdown of all of the oil and gas going into Europe. Again, I think that this is kind of like a it's interesting to see if Russia would actually engage in it, given the fact that this is almost a fait accompli now as far as the energy industry in Europe is concerned. But in order to maintain influence, I think that we have been discussing most of the major areas, with the possible exception of LNG.
I think if I could answer as well on my part, I think one area where Russia could exert still some pressure is through some of the state-owned companies such as Gazprom, participating in the development of energy projects elsewhere in the world. And that could potentially lead to certain disruption, potentially, of some of these energy fuels that could be going particularly to Europe. One example from some of my conversations with experts in the energy field is one particular project is the planned pipeline from Nigeria to Europe, where it is not clear yet, but apparently Gazprom will be interested in participating in not only in the development, but particularly on the financing of the project. And I think this will be also the case in other energy projects, particularly as the EU will, the EU and other European countries will continue to try and diversify the supply of energy over the coming years. So I wouldn't be surprised if we were to find some Russian influence, particularly in projects in Latin America, for instance, in Africa, of course, to basically exert more pressure.
Thank you so much for answering that. I think, unfortunately, this is all we have time for today in terms of the questions. Before we go, though, I'm going to turn you back over to Adam, who's going to tell you a little bit more about our products and services that can help you navigate these uncertain times. Adam, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Judith. I don't want to turn this into an extended sales pitch. I'd just like to mention that we're in the process of rolling out 2 new products that I think could be very useful for both security teams and intelligence teams. What we're doing is using commercial advertising data run through our behavioral analytical software to find threat actors and changes in risk before this kind of information is noted by the market and it shows up in newspapers or even is seen by our analysts. The first product that we have is Monitor, which helps us offer risk analytics and intelligence as a service, combining our outstanding insights team, of which Seb and Tim are a part, with our unique proprietary software. Long story short, what we want to do is monitor client locations to see what changes are going on, see what kind of behaviors we note that could represent a threat to clients, and see what kind of movement is taking place near our clients' facilities so that we can understand both the baseline and any changes that might represent a potential threat to our clients. Discover is the sister product of Monitor, and where Monitor looks at things on a micro level, Discover looks at behaviors at a macro level. It's a threat behavioral tool that looks at city, country, regional, and even global levels to monitor threat behaviors and to automatically alert our clients to any kind of shift in behavior or risk that might indicate that there's a potential problem. Again, I don't want to turn this into an extended sales pitch. I am available and happy to discuss if anyone would like. And conveniently, our contact information can be found on this slide. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. It's been a pleasure, and we are available as always if we can be of service. Thank you and have a good day.